In this presentation, we're going to talk about the basics of research design. When we're designing a research project, we have various aspects that we have to touch on before we go out to the field and start collecting data. Firstly, we have to develop a research question or multiple questions that we're interested in answering through social research. Next, you select the purpose for your investigation. You want to figure out what kinds of things are you looking for? What kinds of things do you expect to find? Next, you select a method for answering that question. So you come up with a research question. Now the next step is, well, how are you going to answer that? You also have to decide on the unit of analysis that you're going to use. Are you going to look at individuals? Are you going to look at groups, families, cities, states, counties, these kinds of things? So what is your unit of analysis? What level of social life are you going to be analyzing? And then the next step is to collect those data and then analyze them. First, you have to develop a question about the social world. Is X related to Y? Is sex related to income? So these are important questions to ask yourself about when you're going out into the field. Next, you want to select the purpose of your research. So you want to figure out, are you trying to explore some questions? Like, are you Googling some things you're interested in? Are you trying to describe something? Are you going to write it down and present it to somebody, just describing what you found? Or explanation. We're trying to explain something about the relationships between these variables and how that relates to the social world. Let me touch on the three purposes of research. We have exploration, which is really about satisfying your own curiosity. You're trying to see if you want to do a future study on something, but that's just trying to figure out a little bit more information about a topic. Description is you satisfy your own curiosity, describe it to others. So you'll maybe do a short research report for the research firm that describes the conclusions of your finding. And then finally, explanation, which is the goal of all of our research. So explanation, we're trying to answer the question of why the variables X and Y are related to one another and why the patterns exist that allow them to be related to one another. Brief note on types of explanatory research. We have two types, idiographic and nomothetic. Idiographic constitutes those research projects that examine all the various causes for a particular event. Let's say you're trying to explain the likelihood of getting the flu. Idiographic explanatory research says, what are all the possible X's, predictors, independent variables that could lead to Y? It could be riding public transportation. It could be interacting with people who are sick. So you're listing all the possible predictors for an outcome, the likelihood of getting the flu. You'll notice that you're exhausting all the possible predictors. What that means is when you're looking at a certain outcome, there could be hundreds of predictors of a specific outcome. Good social research is really focused on how can we explain this outcome with the fewest possible X variable. And that leans a little bit more towards the nomothetic approach, which is explaining an outcome in a way that identifies one or a few causal factors that can generally impact a class of offense. So instead of just looking at the flu, you could say sickness. And then instead of looking at going on public transportation, meeting somebody who's sick, you say, actually, I'm looking at what increases the likelihood that somebody will be sick. Interaction with others. That includes going on public transportation. That includes going out to eat around other people. So you see how it sort of clusters causal factors into one variable, interaction with people. So we lean towards the nomothetic approach. Next, we have an example, positive or negative opinions about marijuana. An idiographic approach would say, we're going to ask one person about what influenced her views about marijuana. Why did she have positive or negative views about marijuana? We can look to her parents. What are their opinions? What do her teachers say about marijuana? Is she religious? Has she experienced marijuana herself? All of these things could contribute to one person's opinion about marijuana. And that is what we call an idiographic approach. It's looking for all possible X's that lead to one Y. And usually it's for one specific person. A nomothetic approach would be what influences opinion about anything? Well, sometimes it's political orientation. Sometimes it's one's occupation. Sometimes it's education. These are classes of factors. We're not saying being a Democrat or being a Republican or working in this kind of job. We're just saying these classes of factors can influence a class of an outcome, marijuana opinion. This is very important. So in experimental work, you're looking at the effectiveness of a drug, for instance, and you say, I'm going to look at 1 milligram of this drug and see how the organism in the Petri dish responds. Okay, 2 milligrams is the next trial. 3 milligrams is the next trial. And you're only looking at how one factor, the drug, is influencing only that organism. It's hard to do that with social research. Why is that? Well, something like a STEM-based project on smoking might not work. The only way to control everything in social life is to put somebody in an experiment, and even then, it's probably not going to be ethical. We can think of like the Tuskegee study, right? When people were given syphilis and they were controlled and watched to see how the disease progressed. In real life, we can't do those kinds of things. A strong test of the impact of smoking on someone's life is to say, we're going to assign you to the control group, we're going to assign other people to the 1 cigarette a year group, 1 cigarette a month group, 1 cigarette a day group, there's going to be 1 cigarette an hour group, and then we see what the outcomes are for everybody based on different levels of cigarette consumption. Can't really do that because human beings need to be treated without harm. So instead, we've developed a way to attempt causality in social research through these 3 steps. One is that there has to be a correlation between X variable and Y variable. X and Y have to move in similar ways. There has to be some co-relationship between X and Y. Second, in order for X to influence Y, X also needs to come before Y or precede Y. So the independent variable, the predictor, needs to come or take place before the Y variable, right? Age comes before political orientation. Sex comes before income. People don't choose sex based on their income. However, the reverse is likely more true. And then finally, non-spuriousness. Non-spuriousness means that there's not another third variable that could explain the relationship between X and Y. And if you look at spurious relationships, oftentimes they don't make sense. We often use the example of the relationship between shoe size as our X variable and math skill as our Y variable. And we say as shoe size gets bigger, math skill also goes up. How can that be? There is a third unmeasured variable that's there, and we can call that age. As age goes up, shoe size goes up to an extent. And as age goes up, math skill tends to go up too. Kids are in higher level math classes and they're taking more math tests. We compare the math skill of a kindergartner to the math skill of an average 12th grader. They're going to have completely different math skills. And because of that, that relationship between shoe size and math skill is a spurious. So the way that we check spuriousness is to throw in third and fourth and fifth and sixth and 15th different variables to see, does the relationship between X and Y disappear? And if it doesn't disappear, we can argue that it's a strong enough relationship. Second, we select a method of investigation. So how are we going to answer this research question? We can do it in various ways. We've seen a bunch of these before. We can go through interviews, surveys, focus groups, which are interviews for multiple people at once, case studies, ethnography. We can do an actual experiment, participant observation where we're watching people or participating. The level of participantness depends on the researcher. You can be more of a participant or more of an observer. Content text analysis using prior surveys or publicly available data. If you're using secondary analyses, you're kind of stuck with the unit of analysis that exists for those data. But if you're not, and you're collecting primary data, you're doing direct observations, then you have the choice of what your unit of analysis is going to be. You can look at individuals, such as students, people, parents, children, voters. You can look at groups of people, gang members, friendship groups, organizations, fraternities, or colleges, social interactions, telephone calls, online chat rooms, and then social artifacts. Next, you select your method of data collection. You're going to do a cross-sectional study, which means you're representing a cross-section of the population at one single point in time. A good way of thinking of a cross-section is like when you cut into a burger. A cross-section would be to cut down the middle, and you see you got the bread, you see the lettuce, tomato, the patty, whether that's meat or veggie, cheese maybe. So a cross-section would just be a cut across the entire population. You can think of the census as a cross-sectional survey. It's based on observations at a single point in time, but it's everybody across. A longitudinal study, on the other hand, is a study that involves the collection of data for the same people at different points in time. You'll study me in 5th grade, and then me in 6th grade, then me in 7th grade, then me in 8th grade, so on and so forth. Then just a brief note on various longitudinal designs. Most people do cross-sectional designs, oftentimes because it's more efficient in the sense that it doesn't take a lot of resources. But various sorts of longitudinal designs include trend studies. You're looking at general shifts in opinions or things like that over time. Opinions about marijuana in 1960, 1965, 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, so on and so forth. A cohort study looks at measurements across time, but you follow people within the same age group or cohort. Many of you are coming into the program as a cohort. You're coming in at the same time. Cohorts can be those kinds of cohorts, or people who started school at the same time. That's a cohort. People who were born in the same year. That's a cohort. There are even cohorts that span years. So the 1950s cohort of births is like 1950 to 1959. So you're studying that subpopulation, that cohort over time. So you're looking at general opinions about marijuana for those born in 1960s or born in the Depression or born in the 90s. Then a panel study is even more specific. You're not studying everybody in a cohort, you're following specific people over time. You're looking at me in my classroom in 5th grade, getting my opinion about religion, and then you ask me again in 10th grade. What's important is you're tracking the same people over time. Panel studies, I will say, are probably the most difficult because it doesn't allow for people to come in and out, whereas cohort studies look at people within the same birth year or program year. And while some people may drop out, other people may add in. When people drop out, you can still get a measurement. In a panel study, you're stuck with everybody who stays on. So let's say in 5th grade, we took opinions about marijuana in my class, and that was 30 students. And then by 10th grade, some had moved away, some had passed away, and you're only left with about 25. Now your panel only exists for 2 time points for only 25 people. Because all 30 didn't have a second time point, those 5 who don't exist in the data set, you can't really call it a panel for that time. This aspect of dropping out, known as attrition, is a big problem for panel studies. So it's important to keep that in mind if you do intend to do a panel study, that attrition will be part of that process. Some people oftentimes don't want to stay part of a study for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? This is again why many people opt for the cross-sectional study.